Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please return to your seats. If you're still writing questions, please continue to do so and pass them to the ushers. We'll go ahead and begin with the question and answer time. The cards, as we requested, that you mark A or C for Ayala and Craig. We will alternate between Ayala and Craig. The person who the question is directed to will have 2 minutes to answer the question, and the other participant will have 1 minute to respond as well. So, without further ado, Dr. Montan will begin with the first question.
Let's have the first question for Dr. Ayala. Given what you know about the speed of the evolutionary process, do you think that the age of the Earth, which geologists estimate to be about 4.5 billion years, represents a reasonable amount of time for the genetic code of a simple organism, say a virus, to evolve into the genetic code of a human purely through random mutation and natural selection? And if so, on what grounds do you believe this? And Dr. Ayala will have 2 minutes to reply, and Dr. Craig will have an optional 1 minute to comment.
This question is a question whether I believe there's enough time, and the answer is yes, there's plenty of time. But I don't know how else can I elaborate. Evolution under natural selection can happen relatively fast, one step at a time, but, and they accumulate over time, 4,500 million years is a lot of time. And life on Earth probably started only about 3.7 billion years or so, which is still a lot of time to give rise to humans and to also other sorts of organisms. So, unfortunately, I don't know what else to add other than answer yes, it's enough time. Obviously, I don't have the time to try to develop an argument of how evolution can proceed relatively quickly, other than some of the examples that I have given, which are simply illustrations.
You have an optional 1 minute to respond.
The Cambrian explosion, in which all of those basic animal groups or phyla appeared on this planet, occurred around 547 million years ago. And so we've got to get this amount of biological complexity from those basic phyla in that amount of time. And you remember the estimate that I gave from Barrow and Tipler, that 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of them is so improbable that it would take the entire stellar evolution of the sun to occur before it would happen. That's about 10 billion years. So each of those steps would take around 10 billion years to happen by these mechanisms. So all of the evidence that I'm aware of, at least, is that these would not produce this kind of biological complexity in this amount of time. If evolution did occur, if common ancestry is correct, then it must have been guided by some kind of a supervising intelligence that directed it toward this end.
Okay, a question now for Dr. Craig. It's a logical fallacy to assert that lack of evidence for one theory constitutes empirical evidence for a contradicting hypothesis. Simply arguing that macroevolutionary change is too complex and too extraordinarily improbable to occur through natural selection does not prove the viability of intelligent design. What clear empirical scientific evidence obtained from peer-reviewed experiments is there for intelligent design?
I'm really glad for this question, because it's important to reiterate that I did not argue tonight that intelligent design is true. I said it's viable. And in the case of these mechanisms, if the mechanisms have not been demonstrated to have the efficacy to produce this kind of biological complexity in this amount of time, then it does seem to me that ID is at least viable. It deserves a place at the table, and that's all I was arguing for. Now, in terms of arguing for its truth, it is again a caricature of these ID theorists like Dembski and Behe to say that they argue, well, because random mutation and natural selection don't work, therefore intelligent design is true. That's not the way they argue. Remember, Dembski gives two very specific criteria for a design inference: extremely high in probability and an independently given pattern. And if something exhibits those two characteristics, then a design inference is justified. So this is not an appeal to fallacious either-or reasoning or ignorance. This is a principled inference based upon defended criteria. So to deny the inference, you've got to either attack the criteria and show why they're incorrect, or else you've got to show that biological systems don't meet the criteria. But let's have none of this claim that we're dealing here with an argument for an ignorance or God of the gaps. That simply ignores the way in which these ID theorists frame their arguments.
So the improbability argument and the argument of independent conditions to demonstrate it was shown with my very trivial experiment with bacteria. You have 10 to the minus 16 probability just in 4 days, and conditions created externally, completely independent of the biology of the bacteria. Let me say one thing that has suggested to me by some of what Dr. Craig has said now and before. You know, in terms of the complexity of life, what is most complex is the development of the cell and the various kinds of cells. So for the first nearly 3 billion years, we have only unicellular organisms, and then we have the Cambrian explosion, then multicellular organisms appear. You know, we have groups of organisms where we have multicellular organisms, are called volvox, for example, that are very similar to unicellular organisms, and we have measured the number of genetic differences, going from one cell organism to a multicellular organism, with cell differentiated by being some reproductive, some otherwise somatic, takes 4 mutations only. Okay. So it can be accomplished very readily.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. For Dr. Ayala, how can you say that God is not the designer of organisms while still saying that you believe in God? What do you think then is God's role?
What was the first part? How do I say that God...
How can you say that God is not the designer of organisms while still saying that you believe in God? What is God's role in your opinion?
I don't know what is the problem. I think the problem is the other way around. Now, depends on what you mean by God being the designer of organisms. Let me give you an example of an experiment I have done, and by the way, Richard Dawkins did many years ago very similar. You make a computer program where little pieces can come together according to certain rules and make more and more complex creatures, and they have different relative rates of reproduction or multiplication depending on the attributes that they have. So you design the program, and you end with multiple kinds of little organisms. These are all computer creatures. I have not designed the organism, but in a way, some other way, I have designed the organism. I am the designer of the program. This is one way to see God as the creator. It doesn't have to be there designing the organism and putting these other things together. And in fact, if I run the program again, it comes with different outcomes. So once again, one can see God as the designer of the universe. I can see God as being my creator. I'm a creature of God. It doesn't mean that God took the little cell in my mother's womb that was fertilized by my father's sperm and had to intervene to develop the grown-up Francisco Ayala that I am. So I have come about by natural process. That's not incompatible with my being created by God.
I think Professor Ayala's position is a consistent one. Even special creationists, as I said, don't think that God created every single species just as is. They may think that God created, for example, a primordial dog, and then all the dogs evolved from that, or he created a primordial bear or a certain type of lizard, and the others came from that. So God is the source of all these things, but doesn't mean that he immediately made them all. So I think his position is quite consistent. But I don't think that it solves the theological problem of evil, because you still have to ask the question, why would God choose to create things through a process which is so filled with waste, death, pain, and suffering along the way? Doesn't this call into question God's goodness? And there I think you have to revert to some sort of animal pain theodicy, such as I offered in my last speech.
Thank you. Dr. Craig, how do you respond to Dr. Ayala's claim that God is the greatest abortionist?
Well, I think that that's very pejorative. I mean, that's emotionally loaded language. Most miscarriages occur because the fetus is in some way deformed. So this is actually, I think, an expression of the mercy of God. These fetuses that are spontaneously miscarried are fetuses that will be born with horrible handicaps or other sorts of disabilities. So this is actually a mercy, I think. And of course, I believe that God is the author and creator of all life, and He has no obligation to prolong anyone's life. If God wanted to strike me dead right now, that's perfectly within His prerogative. I have no claim on a certain amount of life. So I see God as sovereign and providentially in control of the world, and it's entirely within His prerogative what sort of life to give a person and how long that life should be. We have no sort of presumption upon that. It's a gift of God for which we can only give thanks for whatever we do have.
It is correct that most of the spontaneous abortions happen because the developing embryo is defective. That is defective because the design of the human reproductive system is very defective. So still one has to account why the design of the reproductive system is defective. Very interesting issue arises with respect to the problem of explaining why we have a world that has all these problems if God is the creator. I don't have a very good answer. If I would have a very good answer, I will convey it to you. But let me give you a beginning of an answer. God could have created human beings that don't have freedom, that were robots. There will be no crimes, no sins. The robots are not a good substitute for humans. So it's better to have humans. God could have created a world without evolution. There would have been a very dull world, a living world. The millions of species that arise and the tremendous relationships between them give a tremendous beauty to the world that God has created. So it's better to have a world in evolution, even if there is predation, abortion, and all sorts of other things happening. And the same with the world of the galaxies. We have earthquakes and we have all the sorts of things happening in the universe because it's a dynamic world. God could have created a static world. At least I think He could have created a static world. Who am to set the rules as to what God can do or not? But a world in which this dynamism occurs is much more interesting.
Dr. Ayala, do you as a Christian believe that the flaws found in nature's design existed before the entry of sin into the world?
There is a problem with the sound coming from you to me, and I cannot understand hear well.
Do you, as a Christian, believe that the flaws found in nature's design existed before the entry of sin into the world?
Well, of course, there is this explanation which is perfectly acceptable for people from some forms of Christianity which are not the ones that I would subscribe, that it was because of the fall that all these things happened. Many of the problems that we have mentioned occurred before there were humans around, the behavior of the baboons and everything else. Thinking, as I saw in the Museum of Creation on Saturday, I was there, they took me that before the fall, the lions ate vegetables, they don't eat other animals. It's not, at least to me, very convincing. I could make my statement a little more assertive and more disagreeable, perhaps, for those who agree with that view. But to me, it's not very convincing that predators became predators after the fall, and before there were no defects, and before there were no spontaneous abortions.
I think here we begin to see some of the subtlety of the various theodicies that can be offered for animal pain and suffering. I certainly do think that these forms of behavior, these so-called flaws or predation and so forth, pre-existed before the advent of human beings on this planet. But William Dembski offers a very interesting theodicy for animal pain. He argues that God foreknew that human beings would fall into sin and exhibit the kinds of evil behavior that Dr. Ayala described, and therefore he created a world which is, in a sense, already fallen before the advent of human beings in it, because it will then be a suitable environment in which sinful human beings can be brought to their senses through suffering and difficulty and so forth, and in which God will call out people into His kingdom, inviting them to find salvation, forgiveness, and moral cleansing through the gospel of Christ. So Dembski has a very interesting theodicy which sees these aspects of nature as indeed deficits. It's different than the theodicy I gave. He sees them as deficits, but he sees them as preemptively introduced by God because of God's foreknowledge of the human fall into sin. So, just again, it shows that the kind of subtle issues that this can get into, they're not easy to resolve.
Okay. Dr. Craig, if the design hypothesis that you put forth is actually viable, then it seems that the designer must have a viable mechanism of action. Does the designer go in with scissors and tape to rearrange the genome to create changes not attributable to natural selection? What mechanisms do intelligent design theorists propose for this, and are the mechanisms testable?
This is an excellent question. Because the ID camp really is a big tent. It includes people who are theistic evolutionists like Behe and Denton down to people who are six-day creationists. And so they will propose different kinds of mechanisms. What they all agree is that undirected processes would not lead to this kind of biological complexity. So one attractive view would be a kind of progressive creationism which would see God as intervening periodically in the evolutionary process to cause, say, systemic macro-mutations that would in all probability never occur by random chance, but which God causes in order to bring about what would otherwise be, say, a hopeful monster, that is to say, some very radically different life form. And then he allows natural selection and random mutation to take its course. So that would be one possibility, a kind of progressive creationism. Behe, in his most recent book, argues for non-random mutations of some sort, that these would be mutations that would be directed by God, leading ultimately to humanity. So I think there's any number of alternatives, and this would be one of the interesting research projects that ID theorists ought to engage in.
It is very strange for me to think of a process of evolution that is going on, and then once in a while God has to put His hand there to cause some macromutation or second mutation. For me, it's just very difficult to comprehend scientifically, philosophically, or theologically. And I'm going to make another point, and I will have the forgiveness of those of you who believe, like the things that are in the Creation Museum, that things change after the fall. You know, so I'm expressing my views. I'm trying to convince anybody, and why I have problems with certain views. It's hard for me to imagine that the human reproductive system change after the fall as a consequence of sin. So as a consequence of sin, now we have 20 million innocent babies dying every year. So I insist, I don't want to persuade people of different ways of interpreting Christian faith, but I want to know where my problems are.
Dr. Ayala, some people say that the elements needed for the first cell that was needed for evolution to begin could not have existed in the early Earth environment. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Progress towards understanding the origin of life has been tremendous, precisely in the last few years. One of the persons who got the Nobel Prize this year in chemistry have done some important discoveries along those lines, and almost every year we have new discoveries that are starting to take shape, making us understand a little bit more how life may have first originated. We don't have the answer yet, at least in a satisfactory answer. But I have no reason to believe that eventually we will not have the answer.
If I understood the question correctly, it concerned the origin of the first cell of life itself. And this is not something we've talked about tonight. We have been focusing on biology and the evolution of biological complexity. But if you go back before that, you have this enormous question of how life itself originated, and then even before that, the fine-tuning of the universe to make the universe suitable for the origin and evolution of life. And if you're interested in pursuing this, an excellent new book is Stephen Meyer's book, The Signature in the Cell, which shows the difficulties of arriving at the first primitive cell by either chance or by some kind of protein evolution. It just isn't understood at all how this could happen by undirected processes. Now, just in August, there was some very exciting research announced where scientists were able to synthesize 2 RNA bases that could help to explain how, from ID perspective, God arranged the chemical origins to bring about life. But the problem is that these can't exist in nature without being immediately destroyed. You would need to have some kind of superintendence or supervision in order to pull this off and get it into a cellular organism that would be alive. But Meyer's work is very good on this if you're interested.
Dr. Craig, how can Dembski's improbability criterion be a useful tool for justifying design inferences?
Yeah, I'm not following Brad. There's an echo, and so it's a little difficult to hear.
How can Dembski's improbability criterion be a useful tool for justifying design inferences? It's vague, and it seems that one can never make a conclusive case that something is sufficiently improbable and thus has to be designed.
Well, I guess I don't think that that's a good objection at all. Dembski talks about a probability bound beyond which anything is so improbable that it could not happen by chance alone. And he computes this mathematically. And in addition to that, the rational person will make decisions based upon probabilities. So that if you're able to formulate probabilities about the origin of any phenomenon, and it's sufficiently improbable, and then it conforms to an independently given pattern, that combination will tip you off that it's not the result of chance but of design. So, for example, if, say, Bob got a birthday present, his wife gave him a car for his birthday. Now, if that had a license plate number that said CHT728, out of all of the possible license plate numbers, that's enormously improbable that he would get that. But that wouldn't occasion any surprise. That would seem by chance. But suppose Bob was born on August 8, 1978, and the license plate said BOB 8878. Well, then he would be obtuse to say, well, there's nothing unusual about that, nothing to be explained here. It's highly improbable, plus it conforms to an independently given pattern, and that tips you off that this isn't just the result of chance. So it seems to me that Dembski's criteria are quite manageable and are good.
You know about improbabilities. It may amuse you, and I was mentioning today to somebody that I'm receiving this year, like every year, several honorary degrees. This year I finished 7. What is the probability that 2 universities in 2 different countries will offer to present me the honorary degree on exactly the same day, November 24? One, the University of Buenos Aires, and the University of South Bohemia. Very low, but this happened. But that's because I have some angels that work to my benefit, because I told the people in Buenos Aires, 24th of November, I'll go to Buenos Aires, and I told the guys in the Czech Republic, you better move it to May. 24th of November in Czechoslovakia is 10 degrees below 0. But now, more seriously, going back to the argument of improbability, you don't need to argue with Professor Dembski, because by his own argumentation, he does not exist. You see, his genetic makeup has a mother component and a father component. The mother during her life produced about 500 eggs, each one with different genetic composition. The father produce about 10 to the 12 sperm, each with a different genetic composition. The probability that he would get the two right compositions is 10 to the minus 15. That's bad enough. But the probability that his father had the right genetic composition is 10 to the minus 15. That his mother had the right genetic composition is 10 to the minus 15. So going one generation back, the probability that Dr. Dembski exists, by his own argumentation, is 10 to the minus 45. If I go one more generation, the probability he exists is smaller than the reciprocal of the number of atoms in the universe. Those arguments have no seriousness for any serious scientist.
Dr. Ayala, does a God who sits by idly while natural mechanisms produce generations of baby-killing baboons, for example, seem any less cruel or impotent than the God who has designed them?
I apologize, but I think you have to tell me again.
Okay.
We are getting an effect here.
Very difficult to hear.
Which probably you don't. So maybe you should be answering the question, because you probably hear it better.
Does a God who sits by idly while natural mechanisms produce generations of baby-killing baboons seem any less cruel or impotent than a God who has designed them?
Oh, there's a big difference. You see, I live in Irvine, and just across from my house is an ecological reserve where my wife and I walk almost every evening. There are lots of coyotes. Assume that a coyote comes and attacks me and bites me. Is that an act of cruelty, or is it an immoral act? No, this coyote is not a moral subject. Now assume that when I'm walking the next day, a mugger comes with a dog and attacks me with a dog, and the dog bites me. Then there's a moral act, the moral act of the mugger, not of the dog. So I think it's a big difference between attributing design, immediate design to God, or having consequences of this work which is so diverse. It's the same, for the same reason we don't attribute our sins to God. We have freedom because God has given us free will, but we don't attribute to God our sins. We are moral subjects, the baboons are not.
Well, this issue came up in the forthcoming issue of the journal Theology and Science in a discussion of Dr. Ayala's view. And it's interesting that the participants there see exactly the same problem that the questioner did. Chris Doran, in his article, says, Ayala's strategy only pushes the problem back one step and thus ultimately leaves us in much the same place we were before. And so you've got to ask, well, why would there be a God who would create human beings by means of a process which would result in so much miscarriage and death? And Dr. Ayala's answer to Chris Doran, and you heard it tonight, is simply that, well, that kind of world is more exciting. Well, that doesn't seem to me to be a very persuasive justification for the permission of that sort of pain and suffering and death. I think we need a much more powerful theodicy than simply saying that a world with evolution is exciting. And so that's why I tried to offer a bit of a theodicy in my final speech for animal pain and suffering. And I, in my written works, have a great deal more to say about human pain and suffering as well, and why a loving and omnipotent God might prefer a world that involves this kind of suffering rather than a world in which there is no suffering at all.
Dr. Craig, is intelligent design just a God of the gaps argument? And haven't God of the gaps arguments been shown to be problematic?
I've addressed that already tonight, Brad. It is not a God of the gaps argument. Now, for those who wonder what that is, God of the gaps argument is a form of argument that says, well, we can't explain this, therefore God must have done it. And that's obviously a very weak sort of argument. Rather, as ID theorists offer their argument, they first lay down criteria for detecting design. criteria that, as I say, have a wide applicability in other fields. In crime scene investigations, for example, how can you tell the fire was a result of arson rather than natural causes? In intellectual property protection, how do you know a passage was plagiarized deliberately rather than merely produced independently with similar wording? In the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, how do you distinguish mere noise from outer space with a signal that exhibits an intelligent design behind it? So these criteria are developed by ID theorists with a view toward detecting design in a multiplicity of different fields, and they function well there. The question is, in the field of biology, do biological organisms exhibit these same criteria? So it's not at all an argument for God of the gaps. In fact, it's not really an argument for God at all, as I explained tonight. It's simply saying that there is a justifiable design inference here based on these criteria. To deny that, you've either got to attack the criteria, or you've got to show that biological organisms don't meet these criteria. But it's not a matter of God of the gaps or appeals to ignorance. That's failing to engage with these ID theorists in their theories of design inferences.
It's interesting that, like the person who asked the question, I heard the argument of the gaps several times about the origin of life, about the mutations to have resistance to malaria and others. So at least I heard that argument repeatedly. Let me add one personal thing. Again, you have to bear with me. You know, one of the reasons why I write in journals like Theology and Science, and Dr. Craig didn't read from the article that follows, the one that he read, which is by me, one of the reasons why I write in theological journals is because I have a PhD in theology. The first two books I wrote in my life were theology books. One was a commentary about the incarnate verb in Spanish. The other one was a commentary about the early views in the Bible about human origins. That was in Latin. So I have a PhD in theology. I feel I can talk about theology whenever it seems convenient, although I feel much more comfortable, of course, speaking science, which is where I have been working now for many, many years.
Okay, well, here's a theology-related question. What do you think about mankind's ability to know God's intentions? And specifically, for example, how you seem to be assuming that God intended for evolutionary processes to occur to lead to some sort of end, like us. Do you think that we can know that God wanted that?
I frankly don't dare to think about that question. I just couldn't know how to think of what God's intentions were. But if I take a position which I like to take, which is from my point of view, I will argue, as I did before, that I can think myself as being a creature of God. There is a view of Christian providence that says, well, I was predicted by God in God's mind, and God has an infinite mind, which is perfectly reasonable. I'm quite willing to live with it, but I'm more interested perhaps in seeing myself as being a creature of God without trying to interpret too much what God's intentions are. I will go back to the problem of free will. God has given us free will that has consequences, including crimes and misdemeanors and sorts of horrible things that are done by us. Did God intend these things to happen? Well, it's good that we have free will. I think we are better than robots without free will. That's a price we pay. What the intentions of God are, or could have been, I do not know.
This is an enormous assumption that underlies the argument about design flaws that many people have pointed out. The person who perceives flaws in nature's designs and says, therefore, this could not have been made by an intelligent designer, any engineer could do a better job, is presuming to know God's intentions or the mind of the designer. I remember once talking with an electrical engineer at University of California, Davis, and he said to me, why, we engineers design suboptimal systems all the time. He says, we do it perhaps for cost effectiveness because it might be too expensive to put in the really good materials, or we do it to keep the size a certain dimension. It would cost too much to shrink it down, or there are just myriad reasons for why engineers will design systems that are suboptimal. And so when these critics of intelligent design look at things in nature and say, well, that nerve that runs so long around the thorax of this creature to its larynx, that could have gone a lot more directly, say that this is a flaw, they are presuming to know the mind of the designer and what he had in mind, and that no intelligent person could have done such a thing. That's just enormously presumptuous. I think that rather than focusing on the flaws, we ought to look at the organism as a whole, and we would see that it's a marvel of engineering, even if it exhibits sometimes certain features that may puzzle us.
Dr. Craig, there are a number of questions about your claim about dogs and cats feeling pain.
Yes.
So I will have to ask about that. What's your proof that only hominids can be aware of pain? One person asked, another person asked.
I'm not hearing you.
What's your proof that only hominids can be aware that they're in pain? There's one question.
Let me refer you to Michael Murray's book, Nature Read in Tooth and Claw, published by Oxford University Press. This was a real eye-opener for me because as a pet owner and an animal lover, I've been deeply troubled by the problem of animal pain. And what Murray points out is that apart from humanoid primates, animals do not have the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the portion of the brain associated with self-awareness. And I noticed in Dr. Ayala's contribution to theology and science, he agreed that humans are the only animals with self-awareness. Now, if that's true, that means that only human beings or humanoid primates can have the awareness that they are themselves in pain. Dogs and cats and horses can be in pain. They have the phenomena of pain. That would be level 2 on that hierarchy that I showed. But they wouldn't have the second-order awareness of being themselves in pain because they don't have self-awareness. And that's hugely significant when it comes to the problem of animal suffering, because it means that animals don't really suffer in the way that you and I do. When we have the awareness that I am in pain, they lack that. There is an analogy to this, however, in human experience that Murray goes into. There's such a thing called blind sight that biologists have found in certain persons, where a person cannot see. He's blind. He can't see anything. And yet, if you toss a ball to him, he'll catch it. And if he walks across the stage, he'll go around the podium. He won't run into it. In a sense, he has a first-order awareness of the things around him, but he doesn't have the second-order awareness of being aware of those things. And so that would be somewhat similar to this notion of having pain awareness, but not the awareness of being in pain. So look at Murray's book for just a fascinating discussion of this subject.
I want to go back for a moment to the issue of the engineer who has not designed an electrical system that is perfect. But if that engineer designs an electrical system that causes fires, we put him in jail. If somebody who has designed a human reproductive system that causes 20 million abortions per year, certainly I don't want that to be my God or any intelligent designer. I'm going to take perhaps a little extra time to come for once in complete agreement with Dr. Craig that by a different argument. I agree with you, the animals don't have self-awareness, which is what will make them aware they have sinned. If you have self-aware, if you know exist as an individual, you are a subject of pain, you know you are going to die, because you see the other people around you, they die. So you are self-aware, you are death-aware. If there is death-awareness, there's ceremonial burial of the dead, because you want to be treated with respect when you die. The only creatures, the only animals that have ceremonial burial of the dead are humans. So humans are, they do that because we have death-aware, and that's a necessary implication of self-awareness. So I think it's perfectly defensible that animals don't have self-awareness, and therefore they don't experience pain as a personal, as it were, attribute.
A final question for both of you. Why are you Christian? Someone asked that, and when we put a particular spin on it, what does the scientific evidence that we've been talking about tonight have to do with you being a Christian? I know it's a big question, but you can answer it briefly. Let's start. You want to start?
Do you want to go first?
You only have 2 minutes.
It's quite a question.
So, who's going first on this one?
If you want to go first, you can.
Oh, okay. Well, I think there are 2 ways or levels on which you can answer this. One would be the kind of existential level, and then the other would be the intellectual level. I think intellectually, I have always had a sense that God exists. From my youngest boyhood, I remember looking out at the stars at night and thinking, where did all of this come from? And as I contemplated the idea of an infinite past going back and back without beginning, it just seemed inconceivable to me that this could regress infinitely without a beginning. There had to be a beginning for everything to get started. And so it always seemed to me that there had to be some sort of a creator and designer of the cosmos. But I just didn't know him personally. I had no relationship with this transcendent being. On an existential level, it wasn't until I was in high school that I began to search for the meaning and purpose of my existence and ask, why am I here? Who am I? What's the reason for being? And frankly, I couldn't find any. I later read the French existentialists in college and found out that I was experiencing at that time this sort of darkness and despair that existentialist philosophers talked about, the absurdity of life. And I deeply felt that blackness and that meaninglessness of life, until a girl who sat in front of me in my German class, a radiant Christian, shared with me about God's love that could be found through Jesus Christ, and that I could know God in a personal way through Christ. I'd never heard this before. I went home, I got a New Testament, and I began to read it. And as I did, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about his teachings that I had never encountered before, and there was an authenticity about his life that was so attractive, so incredibly magnetic that I couldn't deny. And this went on for about 6 months. I went through a period of the most intense soul searching I've ever been through in my life. I read books. I met other Christians in the high school. I'd never met people like this, and they seemed to be connected with a different plane of reality than I was, that I didn't even dream existed, a reality that gave a deep existential meaning and significance to their lives. And so after about 6 months of just intense searching, I just came to the end of my rope and cried out to God, and I yielded my life to Him and asked Christ to be the Savior of my life and the Lord of my life, and I became a Christian in that moment. That was on September 11th of 1965 that event occurred, and it changed my life, and my studies as a philosopher and as a theologian are simply an expression of that decision that was made then as a young man. I have found that you can love God with all your mind as well as with all your heart, and that He meets the needs of your intellect as well as the needs of your heart. And so I am enthusiastically a Christian, both intellectually as well as existentially.
September 11. Think about curious coincidences. For me, as I see it, religious faith can be the source of motivation to to study the world of nature, to do science, and to try to find out more about this wonderful world in which we live. And on the other direction, I think that the beauty of the world, which despite of all the things that happen, we have this tremendous beauty with thousands and thousands of millions of species and all this dynamic process. I see that as a source of religious inspiration. So doing science can help faith, and having faith, I think, is a motivation to do science.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayala, Professor Craig, Professor Montan.